Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Killian. I have a male appearance, longish brown hair, a beard, a shirt, and yes, I want to share some informations about the formations that the IIP is offering. So our institute, it's an international institute for psychoanalysis, and we offer two formations, which are both starting in September, and enrollment is open now already. And I just want to share some words about them, how they differ or what they are about. So there's one, it's called a Foundations for Contemporary Psychoanalysis. So it's a foundations program that is open to anybody who is interested in psychoanalysis, who also maybe comes from a different field, has a different background, who does not yet maybe know a lot about it, but is curious about what psychoanalysis can offer from different perspectives, also outside the clinic. And this program is it's focused a lot on getting some of the basics clear. So using some basic texts of Freud and Lacan as a starting point, but then also see how it can be applied to the contemporary world, because that's what we're interested in. How can we apply psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic thought to the modern world? What does it mean? So trying to examine that and also open the field for what does that include. So for example, we have a class which takes into consideration how to work with people with autism, for example. How do we integrate questions of gender, race, and class into psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic thought? And another one is also, for example, about post-humanism. So we really go also into these questions, into details, and try to examine these aspects critically, how they can be applied. The other program that we offer is for clinicians. It's called Techniques for a Contemporary Clinic. So this one is taught by professors with clinical experience, while the other one, you have also teachers from lots of different backgrounds. The second formation is focused a lot, again, on contemporary, what does it mean to practice contemporary psychoanalysis? So well, how can it be used in the clinic? How can we apply our clinical practice to a contemporary world? On the base, especially of late Lacan on topology, how can these principles be applied? So there's also theory involved, but it's also a lot about the application of this theory and how it can even be further developed, or is being developed at the moment also after Lacan's death. It also includes supervision, where you can bring your own material, which can be discussed. It includes clinical cases as examples for discussions and learning. It also includes research. So how can we use what we see in clinical practice to develop ideas further? And also this program, like the other one, is also really has this interdisciplinary approach. So inviting artists, scientists, philosophers who bring in a different perspective, which I think can be very helpful to open up the field of thought and the field of practice even more. Yeah, from the technical side, both these formations are online. Live classes are on Fridays and Saturdays. They are simultaneously translated into English, Portuguese, and French, so you can follow them in your preferred language live. And they are also, of course, being recorded, so you can watch them at any time, depending on how your schedule looks like. And then there's a huge library of already recorded material to be watched as a preparation for these classes. This is like how they are designed, how they are constructed. And like I said, they both start again in September. So they're always ongoing classes, of course, but the next two formations start in September. And when you're interested, you find the links. Barbara posted the links in the chat already if you want to read more about it. And like I said, enrollment is open already. So if that interests you, feel free to get in touch and have a look. Yes, and at this point, I would like to give the word to Jed to start his presentation, who is also teacher at the IIP.
Thank you, Killian, and thank you, Barbara. Thank you again to our interpreters. We couldn't do this without you, of course. Gabo and Anthony, we really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm touched to see you, touched that you made the effort to come out on a Saturday to spend time with us. As a part of our policy of hospitality for those who may have a visual impairment, I'll give a brief audio description of myself before I begin. I'm a white cis man with brown hair and a beard, glasses. I'm beaming in from my office in Maine, where you see behind me the light streaming in through two windows with curtains of white and blue, a bookshelf that has atop it not only some plants, but a topological object, a Klein bottle. With that, I think I'll go into a little more personal disclosure than I normally do in such talks. It seemed merited for this one in particular to say something more in the register of autobiography. So forgive me for this terrible indulgence. But I'll begin there with a few notes of along the line of questioning who is the speaker who's giving this talk on Thelonious Monk and psychoanalysis. Today, I have the pleasure and the suffering, no doubt, of simultaneously addressing you from two territories in my being that usually I imagine to be quite distinct, though the conceit of this talk is that they were never actually separate or even separable the whole time. I speak to you as a psychoanalyst who happens to be a musician, and a musician who happens to be a psychoanalyst. When it comes to the analyst that I am, I've been at this work for about 12 years, so I'm just getting started. As for the musician that I am, I have no conscious memory of not being one. My encounter with music, by way of the piano, most of all, began so early that historically I don't have any non-musical life to draw upon, which, if I'd been paying more attention, should have cued me into the fact that my psychoanalytic life wouldn't have had any chance of not also being musical, which is to say, my psychoanalysis had to be music. Then again, as the old adage goes, the fish don't know anything about water because, well, you know why. Why speak of these two passions together now? I'm a little surprised by it myself. It's probably left a bit mysterious, probably best left a bit mysterious. But I think it has something to do with the fact that the kind of psychoanalysis that I find emerging in my practice and in my thinking over these last few years seems to move closer to music. Music understood here as a dynamic field of relationships between abstract objects. I'm a Lacanian, but not the kind I used to be. From the beginning, I'd been fascinated by Lacan's late work. The idea that he'd become captivated by an exotic mathematical language called topology, that he'd spent countless hours contemplating knots. This all seemed very tantalizing, but also intimidating. And for many years, I kept a respectful distance. It was only a matter of time, though, before curiosity got the best of me. I've always loved weird things. Eventually, I had to dive in, and before I knew it, I was spending hours contemplating the abstruse and immensely seductive concepts that I found within the worlds of topology and dynamical systems theory. It was and continues to be perplexing, maddening, then illuminating, then perplexing and maddening again, and so on. In the words of the great poet John Cougar Mellencamp, it hurts so good. beginning from the wild conjecture of the late Lacan that the real is topological. In other words, the unconscious is a space that doesn't conform to the laws of Euclidean geometry that have so profoundly shaped our common sense. In other words, still, quintessentially, you and I are space-time, an evolving, constantly changing set of spatiotemporalities, exhibiting a dizzyingly diverse range of possible structures, forms, shapes in motion. I propose to you that not only the psyche, in the key of the late Lacan, but a piece of music also is a dynamical system. But before I go any further, let me define these weighty mathematical terms, hopefully in a friendly, hospitable way. If you look in the chat, you'll be able to find that we're going to put some glossaries, by the way, in each language represented here. You can hold on to this as you go. Let's start with a dynamical system. I'm going to try to define this in a friendly, hospitable way. We could say a dynamical system is a space of possible states and the dynamics that shape its process of becoming over time. And topology gives us the language for describing this space of possible states, its shape, its connectedness, its neighborhoods, its boundaries. I'm going to propose today that the phenomenon of music and the phenomenon of human subjectivity converge in this domain of dynamical systems whose fundamental architecture is described most rigorously by the concepts of topology. That's our preamble. Now we dive in. We have a space traversed in time, true for a musical work, true for a recurrent clinical phenomenon. I need to make a differentiation right off the bat to set the table for the kind of material we're going to be working on today. I want to differentiate between musical, clinical, and dynamical spaces that do not exhibit recurrent behavior and those that do. I'll start with music. There are plenty of pieces of music that have this quality of being what's called through composed. They are perpetually opening out onto new and unprecedented harmonic and melodic horizons. They're not structured in such a way that they reach a kind of finiteness of form and then return to repeating motifs. A famous example would be Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, important piece from around the turn of the 20th century. The parallel in the clinic would be material that's highly novel or even stochastic, meaning seeming to be based on chance, wildly unpredictable. This is the emergence of new trajectories of movement without discernible patterns that it settles into. In topology, we think of this as related to spaces that lack what's called compactness. These are spaces in which the trajectories can escape to infinity. What I want to work on today, though, is in the realm of recurrent behavior. Things that do take on this quality of the repeating. So we're going to be thinking about spaces, musical spaces, subjective spaces that are finite and bounded and can produce and support this effect of recurrent trajectories or orbits through the space. There's a very important mathematical theorem that helps us think about these types of spaces. It was given to us by Henri Poincaré, who uh, stumbled upon it while trying to uh, deal with the three-body problem, a very famous problem in mathematics and science. I think about this fact that in failing to definitively discharge this problem, the three-body problem, he managed to invent dynamical systems theory and discover chaos. So, you know, I hope all of us can be so generative in our failures, you know. So what does Poincaré say in his recurrence theorem? He tells us that in a finite volume space, you just imagine a space that's finite in its nature, almost every orbit returns infinitely many times to a neighborhood surrounding its starting point. Neighborhood, by the way, we're not just saying in a loose, poetic way, though it is indeed poetic. It is a precise topological term, which has to do with an arbitrary delineation of nearness around an element or a point. So if we think about this for a moment, we're learning that if the space is finite, the shape of that space ensures that the orbits are going to return infinitely within or to the neighborhood of a starting point, right? Um, this is going to be important for thinking about clinical material that we would associate with repetition, even including in the Freudian sense. I want to keep Freud nearby and the notion of the repetition compulsion, because it's a very important early elaboration about recurrent phenomena in the clinic. But I want to just hold it in a little bit of wry critical distance in the sense that I don't want to take on board necessarily all of the presumptions that come with the notion of repetition compulsion for what I'm going to be speaking about today. Um, what do I mean? Well, I don't want to say that when we're talking about recurrent behavior that we notice in a dynamical system clinically, that we need assume something like the operation of a death drive. We can just hold this at bay for a moment. Similarly, an idea that is very related to repetition in the clinic from Lacan's lexicon, the fundamental fantasy. This can, of course, um, serve us well in certain cases, and I'm going to be referring to it here and there, but I don't want to assume for today's purposes that every recurrent phenomenon is necessarily reducible to the logic of the fundamental fantasy as Lacan explicates it. So working with recurrence, repetition clinically, it's intuitive for us. We see this constantly. We see it in our lives, of course. Sorry, we have a okay, microphone was unmuted. We see this constantly in our lives, of course, but clinically, this is one of the major aspects of an ongoing analytic endeavor is getting a hold of the form of these recurrent phenomena. I'll give you three examples from recent clinical work. These are just very terse encapsulations of a particular type of recurrent phenomenon in three cases. Patient X reports a tendency to repeatedly enter into social environments in which they feel alienated and impinged upon by conventional discourses that go unquestioned. They find themselves again and again wanting to provoke the others in these social engagements and to foment dissent, but refraining from doing so. They're perplexed by these urges, which feel out of place with their otherwise affable social manner. Patient Y, who works in a helping profession, has long felt a mix of fascination and fright when experiencing a recurring and powerful inclination toward solitude and reclusion, one that has resulted in a progressive set of withdrawals from various social roles. They sense an alluring wildness utterly beyond interpersonal entanglement that they hesitate to fully enter for fear that the persona they've cultivated for the others will be entirely undone. Patient Z notices a tendency for their identity to merge with that of the group, resulting in their undertaking heroic efforts to fulfill vital functions on the group's behalf. Time and again, however, these efforts leave them feeling depleted and betrayed when it is revealed that, despite their striving, the group's pathology persists, and worse, that the group does not care for them the way that they care for it. Again, very crystallized, simplified examples of the types of uh, phenomena that people report uh, repeating again and again through the life, something they bring to the analysis to put into question. Well, the wager of this talk is that we can learn something about these types of subjective events from music, which also exhibits recurrent phenomena. Music, which we can also model as containing orbits through a finite uh, bounded space. Specifically, I want to work with jazz improvisation, and its structure of uh, generating new improvised material upon a stable structure. This is related to a very, very old form in our musical traditions called theme and variation. Very famous examples are Bach's Goldberg variations, Beethoven's Diabelli variations is another one. Our focus is going to be on how the jazz tradition tends to use this mode of theme and variation. And we're going to look then at what I think is unique in Thelonious Monk's particular way of engaging with this tradition. This is where he will become improbably a psychoanalyst suddenly, I think. I want to be clear as I can for those who may not have a lot of basis in musical structure and form, music theory. So let's set the table for this analysis of music. Very simply, when you hear a melody, which is just a succession of notes that are grouped together, forming a kind of gestalt, a whole of their own, uh, built of phrases that probably become uh, lyrically seductive to us, maybe, and familiar. Um, when you hear this melody, most of the time, it possesses an underlying harmonic structure that gives it its basis. Harmonic here means having to do with these beautiful encapsulations, these beautiful moments at which pitches arrive together through their interweavings and create what sometimes are called chords. It's a little group of pitches or notes that create an effect that is a whole that is larger than the sum of its parts, as the saying goes. These chords have different uh, characters to them, and these characters can be employed in different ways, having different functions in different musical material. So you're already picturing a kind of two-level structure here. We have a harmonic basis or infrastructure, atop of which we can have these elaborations of melody. In a theme and variation form, we give the theme first, which is the melody that perhaps becomes the signature, of this piece. But then we elaborate, we concatenate, we dream new melodic lyrical inventions that are nevertheless built upon that same underlying harmonic structure. You see me making this motion with my hand, and you can already probably pick up that intuitively I have in mind here this phenomenon of recurrence in a finite volume bounded space. So in this way of thinking it, when I'm improvising over the chord changes, the harmonic structure of a song, I'm traversing a finite space. And when you listen to a great jazz improviser who's playing over, for instance, one of the what are called standards, the material that gets played again and again and again ad infinitum, you're actually hearing these traversals of the same harmonic circuit again and again and again. And in this finite recurrence, infinity is born. The space can be traversed again and again in new ways. This is why great jazz improvisers like, somebody who comes to mind like Lee Konitz was playing the same 5 songs for probably 7 decades, because there was always more that this structure yielded. Yes? Thelonious Monk, whose dates, by the way, are 1917 to 1982, was a jazz pianist who was a key figure in the bebop revolution of the 1940s. But I think his singularity was undeniable from the beginning to the very end. And there is something in Monk that absolutely transcends his affiliation with bebop, or even with jazz. Why not? He's a very beloved composer of some of the most subtle, sophisticated compositions in the jazz repertoire. I noticed that there's something peculiar about Monk's place in the jazz piano pantheon. This as somebody who spent many feverish hours in life studying the jazz piano tradition from a very young age, and in a certain way has never stopped. The peculiarity of his place, I don't know if everybody would agree with this, but is that he's beloved by all and imitated by none, I think. We have this phrase we sometimes say about somebody who's absolutely great in a very idiosyncratic way. We might say they're inimitable. And I think this is often meant in the following way. Not that you can't imitate them, but that you can't succeed fully. You could try to emulate the contours of their style, and you would just fail utterly because there's something so unique in the suchness of them. This is indeed true of Monk, but I think we could say Monk is inimitable in yet another way, which is that there's an intuition on the part of the student not to even try. It's too of its own. It's too singular to desecrate with even a loving imitation. This is debatable, but this is how I came to see it as I was uh, beginning my studies as a jazz pianist so many years ago. There's a quote attributed to Monk, in fact, which is that the genius is the one most like themselves. Here, genius is linked not so much to mastery of a form, but to singularization of the style, something that will become important as this talk goes on. Could we say Monk is the one most like himself in the jazz pantheon? The reason I work with Monk today rather than the jazz tradition in its totality or some other improviser, and obviously there's many that I love, is a return to listening to Monk in recent months got me thinking about his relationship to structure, to form, how unique it is. I started to think, even amongst the figures that he collaborates with, and uh, even amongst very many great inventors and innovators within the jazz tradition, there's something very specific about how Monk treats form. And the more I contemplated it, the more it brought me back to, you guessed it, dynamical systems, and you guessed it, the couch, the clinic. I'm going to try to argue something a little weird about Monk. Remember, I was talking about how theme and variation works. Usually in jazz, I'm elaborating upon this harmonic structure, producing variations upon variations, um, or variation after variation upon this structure. The core of my thesis is that what Monk reveals in his style is not a variation upon a structure, but a variation of the structure itself. And this is going to matter for the clinic in a profound way once we make the translation. I've got to justify this though. Really, he doesn't vary upon the structure. Well, of course he does on one level, but what interests me in Monk is something subversively amelodic, something in him that refuses the continuity of melody. He wrote some of the most beautiful melodies in the jazz tradition, strangely. But there exists in him this sensibility with respect to how melody, lyricism, and variation upon theme usually works that pushes against certain tendencies. You can see this not only in his style of improvisation, which I'll be speaking more about, but also sometimes in particular compositions of his which utterly are divested of melodic elaboration. One of my favorite examples is the song um, Evidence, which I think, I'm not so sure this is true, but I think it might be true, derives its title from a little bit of wordplay. Its harmonic structure is actually pulled from a famous old standard called Just You, Just Me. I don't know how this is going to carry over into other languages, but from just you, just me, he gets just us, which in English sounds a bit like justice. And then he says justice gets you to evidence, right? Where's your justice without evidence? So this song Evidence, which I encourage you to listen to when you get a chance. Hell, pull up Spotify and put it on right now while I'm talking if you like. It's a melody comprised entirely of points that don't conjoin into a line. It's a pointillistic non-melody, really. And these points are rhythmically surprising, unsettling, again, subversive. Monk is always kind of eschewing variation, this elaborating, concatenating of new orbits. Instead, it's through pointillism and syncopation. Syncopation being this displacement of the rhythmic material, the arriving early or arriving late, the nudging of the hinge point of the song. It's through pointillism and syncopation that he acts upon the structural underpinnings. It's my view that he submits the harmonic rhythm. That's the rhythmic regime that governs the movement of the harmony. He submits that to variation. So again, variation upon is the typical way. I'm positing that Monk gives us variation of the structure itself. Finiteness holds, though. I want to be clear here. Poincaré recurrence is still in play. Monk does not throw out the form in total. It's not a complete departure from form as such. This may be a thing that we can contend with sometimes clinically, certainly musically, and I'll put that aside for now. I see him varying these, what I'm calling hinge points of the space in the structure of the material. These hinge points are, for me, akin to what in dynamical systems theory are called attractors. Attractors are these sites that pull orbits toward them. And what I think of as the constellation of attractors represents the uh, the set of elements within the space that have uh, uh, this way of giving the shape to the space in its quintessence. It's the fundamental structural components that give the space its particular character. Is this set of attractors. The idea here is that Monk, rather than uh, what I think of as a more typical route through the space of improvisation, rather than navigating this terrain and meeting these attractors, these hinge points in new and creative ways of veering around and through them, which can be, of course, enormously generative. Think of one of his collaborators from the late 50s, John Coltrane, who in that moment in the encounter with Monk is playing these extraordinary bursts of highly entropic sounding material over the chord sequence. This was called his sheets of sound phase, Coltrane, yeah. But it's different than what Monk does and what's audible in Monk accompanying him. My argument is that Monk is actually moving the attractor itself. This eschewal of melody, this refusal of the allurement of the continuous line, I think of as akin to what in Deleuze and Guattari would be called the dismantling of the face. The face for Deleuze and Guattari is this kind of organizing um, function that puts things together into a sort of expressive familiarity, you might say. Melody has this quality of faciality, I think. We love melody, maybe in a similar way as we love narrative. There's an impulse here toward coherence and cohesion, consistency and continuity. Monk dismantles the face. He leaves alone this seduction to the surface of continuity. And he moves again, like I said, toward the structure itself to syncopate and punctuate. The more I contemplated what this could mean for clinical practice, the more I was led back to some work I had done a few years ago thinking about three concepts in psychoanalysis and their interrelation: identification, symptom, and style. This last one is a little bit of a curveball. It's not often thought of as a high psychoanalytic concept, style, but I'm trying to shape it to be one. I'm going to use Monk to think about the passage through identification, symptom, and style unto the end of an analysis. As if I don't have enough references going, I realized that for me, the way this story unfolds maps along a famous Zen phrase from the 9th century. I'll quote the version of it that I like. In a first moment, mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. In a second moment, mountains are no longer mountains and rivers are no longer rivers. Then, in a third moment, mountains are once again mountains and rivers once again rivers. I just told you the secret to psychoanalysis. Just joking, kind of. Let's walk through these moments. First moment in which the mountain is a mountain and the river is a river, I associate with often the preliminary part of a psychoanalysis, or even a pre-analysis, we might say, or any aspect of subjectivity that has not entered what I think of as the space of analysis and transference. This is, for me, often associated with what I think of as the smooth functioning of the regime of identifications. Adam Phillips, the psychoanalyst, has a moment in a interview where he says something like, whenever I hear somebody start a sentence, I'm the kind of person that, dot, 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 he says his heart sinks. It's this regime of identifications which produces this kind of immediate certainty of I'm the kind of person that, and it's not in question, yes? I say this is not yet alienation because the subject is satisfied with the movement through the given space-time, doesn't sense a problem or question. For me, this is preliminary to the whole arising of the dialectic of theme and variation. It's uh, it's sort of like just singing the melody again and again and again. Yeah. Clinically, this is a challenge for us because psychoanalysis, in a certain respect, is the purview of the question. How do we comport ourselves towards these things that, as Freud says somewhere, don't itch? oh, as the saying goes, maybe we don't scratch them. Maybe they'll start to itch on their own, for instance. This can persist well into an analysis, pockets of this uh, nicely functioning regime of identifications. The face in the Deleuze-Guattarian sense, which I would encourage you to hear with all of the resonances of facade, for instance. There's a temptation here, I think, for psychoanalysts to want to rather violently intervene in these spaces of identification, to dismantle the face in a forceful way, to treat this as resistance, which prompts a kind of analytic resistance. But I would argue that Monk is nonviolent with regard to the face. I know I said he dismantles it, the melody, and I think he does, but it's more through an invitation to let go of this elaboration and to see what happens when a little space is left open. In fact, there's a document you can find online where somebody wrote down many quotes that they heard Monk say when they were working with him. And one was encouraging the improviser to not play everything every time. Let let something go by. A clinical accompaniment can have this nonviolent, playful style of of allowing for the face to relax, to see what might be possible in the pockets between the warp and weft of the identificatory regime. A playful deforming of its contours. Crucially, I think it's also, for the clinician, a highlighting, a punctuating in this monk-like way, an accompaniment of pointillism and surprising syncopation. It's a highlighting specifically that in the facial identificatory regime that swerves, that doesn't actually conform to the smoothness that would otherwise continue to hypnotize one into a pure identification. The swerve here I have in mind is, of course, related to Lucretius and his beautiful philosophy of the swerve is at the basis of all material existence, really. The fact that all the atoms in the void are perpetually swerving and therefore life is fundamentally indeterminate. The facial regime wants not to know a goddamn thing about this swerve, but it invariably happens. And this, for me, is the arising of the symptom, which correlates with our second moment. When the mountain ceases to be a mountain and the river ceases to be a river. This is the moment of the symptom in its flowering, in its coming into being, in its fecundity. This is the moment where alienation does open up in a fruitful way. It's alienation of two kinds, actually, because it's a confrontation with the idea that there's this not me in the symptom, there's something alien that is operating nevertheless through me and about me. But the other side of it is the more this symptom starts to speak, the more it has its unfolding. It puts into question the possible alien nature of the identificatory regime itself. Starting to sound a bit like, who am I, right? We've entered this space of the question by way of the symptom. The first moment is also akin to Hegel's sense certainty, I think. The thing that kind of is more or less the beginning of the embarking on the dialectic in the phenomenology of spirit. But uh, the moment of the river is no longer a river, the mountain is no longer a mountain. It maps very closely to a Hegelian notion that A no longer just equals A. I move beyond this tautological self-identity of things. Things are now not exactly what I thought they were. And it's at this moment, in my view, that the traversal of the space through this recurrence can truly begin to become intelligible as a dialectic of variation upon theme, or better, variation upon underlying form or structure. We can truly begin to map structural underpinnings. Where are the attractors? Where are the hinge points? How is this space actually shaped fundamentally? What is its topology? What does that topology make possible? What are the constrictions that the subject is faced with because of the shape of the space? This all unfolds in what I'm calling the second moment. The variations continue to recur out in the life, in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in the transference itself. You know the story. And with each recurrence, the mapping continues, becomes more refined. What had initially announced itself as the swerve from the expected thematic content of the facial identification regime, it now begins to elucidate its logic as a map of attractors. We move from singing the melody again and again to ourselves with no interest in its architecture, to wondering about the ways it fails to sing itself in the expected fashion, to noticing a terrain of variations that had always been there, though we didn't realize it because we were hypnotized by the face. We go to then a discernment of the underlying logic that always gave the melody, and now its pluribundant variations, their essential formal shape. We learn the harmonic rhythm of the recurrent song. So far, you might say, well, this is no great shakes, right? This is just the traversal of the fantasy that we learn about in Seminar 11, famous formulation of Lacan's. Just to remind us that the traversal of the fantasy is derived from this a reading of Seminar 11, which posits that the desire of the analyst is oriented by or toward absolute difference. I think there's an enigma here, the question of how we go from traversal of the fantasy to the revelation of absolute difference. And Thelonious Monk provides some cues, I think. An idea of how we get from moment 2 to moment 3. Remember that his gambit of pointillism and syncopation, it doesn't just dismantle the face, as I said, it reveals the hinge points of the structure, the constellation of attractors, and importantly, reveals them to be deformable. He illuminates the attractors as within their neighborhoods and demonstrates that the harmonic hinge points are always themselves swaying and swerving a bit, not unto infinity, as in a non-compact space. Structure and recurrence are maintained, but with an expansion of the possible positions of the attractors. Therefore, their intervals the relationships between, and therefore the intricate potentialities of reshaping the constellation of the totality of the attractors. This, for me, represents how the analytic endeavor can take us beyond traversal of the fantasy and even identification with the symptom, another crucial idea of Lacan's, to what I'm going to call the assumption of the style. Style I will define in the following way. It's a pretty thick sentence, so bear with me. I'll go slow. The fundamental qualitative structure of a space in which recurrence operates, as apprehended within a paradigm of smooth deformation, in which the hinge points, the attractors, are subjectively lived as neighborhoods, approximate zones of tendency, affinity, and sensibility, whose repertoires of possible movements are experienced in the valence of freedom, though not without a crucial dimension of finitude, finiteness. There's so many elements of this, and I apologize for the density of this terrifying paragraph qua sentence. But the idea fundamentally is that as in the style of Monk, clinically, we become able to deform the place, displace the location of the attractors themselves, these fundamental hinge points of the recurrent structure, we reveal something that goes beyond the symptom. The symptom is the doorway then into this new state I'm calling the style, which is free within finiteness. I don't need to leave entirely the recurrence, the finiteness of the shape. In fact, I, at the end of analysis, don't feel the need to do so. I have assumed the style, my singular style, absolute difference. But what renders it free, rather than just the tyranny of the always the same, is the style as the variation of the structural underpinnings, that there is this movement within the neighborhoods of the hinge points. Analysis then does not so much invent something new in these spaces of recurrence, but it renders anew that which always was. We return to the mountain being a mountain. Though, in an undeniable way, simultaneously, it's not the mountain one spoke of at the beginning of the journey. The river has now become that of Heraclitus, the one you can't step in twice, while paradoxically subsisting as the very same river. Psychoanalytic accompaniment in the style of Monk then aims itself beyond the syncopations of the theme, beyond the syncopations of the variation, into the varying and syncopating of the very structure itself, not in order to eradicate the repetition and its logic, but to demonstrate the emergent style already at play in the symptomatic. This involves an assuming of the essential shape of the recurrence as the signature of one's singularity, albeit in an expanded way, conducive to infinite continuous deformation within a bounded finite volume space. That is, one avows one's song totally, playing it with satisfaction forever in the manner of Nietzsche's eternal return, but in a manner liberated from the fixity of the regime of identification and its deadening thematic drudgery, equally liberated from the suffering of the symptom. Patient X traces the impulse to undermine conventional social structures to a real experience of the social field delineated quite differently with respect to identity, power, gender, and other key axes. This apparently nostalgic vector becomes the basis for the shaping of values and ethics, a whole manner of moving through social spaces, critical and creative, resuscitating the foreclosed possibility. Patient Y moves through fear and fascination into a befriending of the wildness of solitude, becoming increasingly liberated from specific social roles and even from the need to have a place in the social order at all. The persona persists, but playfully, malleably, its hollowness worn occasionally, only to ensure the protection of the dignity of a being that forever eludes and escapes. Patient Z sets to work becoming a more skillful and savvy practitioner of group politics. Increasingly, they refuse to give more to the group than the group offers to them. Rather than retreat utterly from their penchant for identifying with the group into some isolated atomization or a hermetic coupling, they begin to actively partner in the shaping of group structures that are more equitable, more collectivist, in which sacrifice is well distributed, acknowledged, and negotiable. Examples of the um, maintaining, the subsisting of the fundamental shape of the space, but with absolutely crucial variations with respect to the structural underpinnings, which allow for a greater movement of freedom, of possibility. By way of ending, I want to note the limitations of this work. Um, it's something I want to be more disciplined about, is saying what I am saying is not, or what it cannot do, what it cannot attend to. This current work is oriented toward those forms of recurrence that in time take on a symptomatic valence for the subject. These are my concern as I employ these notions derived from Thelonious Monk. It should be stated, however, that subjectivity is not at all encompassed by this kind of clinical phenomenon. I've argued elsewhere that we also accompany processes of recurrence that lack symptomatic valence, forms of repetition that are not the site of subjective questions or alienation, and which are best left alone, sometimes cultivated and expanded. It would be foolish and potentially unethical to attempt to syncopate these attractors, unless it would somehow further their stability. Second caveat, the conceptual schema of extracting style from symptom is probably insufficient for cases in which the sadomasochistic dimension of the repeating structure rises to a level of active threat of harm in the real. This is often the case when a classically perverse capacity for simultaneous knowing and not knowing the truth of the ramifications of one's act operates in a manner that renders the nascent stylistic coordinates compromised by a will to destruction. These instances could be said to reflect a parasitic repetition that jeopardizes the psychic system and its environment. My sense is that the framework I've put forward here would need to be augmented considerably for such cases. Finally, I believe we do accompany from time to time processes that are outside of the logic of recurrence utterly, and therefore outside of compact spaces. In jazz piano terms, we go from Thelonious Monk to Cecil Taylor. That is, we enter spaces in which there's no underlying harmonic rhythm except what is emerging in an ever-opening horizon that is not settled down into a compact shape that would produce discernible repetitions. And it may never. These processes are not inherently superior or inferior to the ones I've dealt with today. With respect to all of the movements of subjectivity, ranging from the highly stable to the stochastic, I argue that we must always begin with a radical agnosticism with respect to the movement's value, meaning, or function. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, Jed, por compartilhar essas
Thank you so
ideias
much, Jed, for
maravilhosas.
sharing these wonderful
Realmente
ideas.
incrível
Really
ouvir essa
amazing.
palestra.
Your
Eu não
conference
sei
was
muita teoria
amazing.
musical, mas
I
eu
don't know a
ouvi
lot
algumas
of
obras.
musical theory, but I was
Realmente muito
traveling in the
interessante.
waves of what you said. Really
Eu
interesting and amazing.
queria abrir
I'd like
para
to open up
perguntas.
now for questions
Estamos
or
ansiosos para escutar o retorno de
comments.
vocês,
We really want to hear a
para
little bit from
destrinchar
the
um
audience.
pouquinho
Maybe we can
essa
unfold a little
estrutura do
bit more
Thelonious Monk.
about Thelonious Monk's structure.
Não se acanhem.
Feel free to join.
Hoje é um dia perfeito para a gente
Today is
conversar
a
sobre
perfect
música e
day to talk about
psicanálise.
music and psychoanalysis. You can
Quer
raise your
fazer alguma
hand
menção, um
or you
comentário,
can
uma
write something
dúvida?
in the chat. You can
Estamos à
make a
disposição.
comment, a question. The floor is open.
Feel totally welcome. You could say anything.
I have a question, and this is more a conceptual questions because I'm trying to picture it in my mind. Is the attractor different from the point in the neighborhood, or it's the same thing?
Thank you. That's an important clarification that I should do. A point or an element can be any site within a space, a topological space, we could say. An attractor would be a specific type of location in one of these spaces that has this tendency of being pulled, or sorry, of pulling orbits toward it. Yes. So it's a particular type of phenomenon in a dynamical system. There are repellers, for instance, which does the opposite. And there's a complex taxonomy of different types of attractors which behave in slightly different ways. I've used it in this more general sense to try to give the impression of a location in the space that remains stable over time and has this quality of drawing orbits into its neighborhood. And neighborhood here would be, again, in this way that sounds very loosey-goosey, but has some technicality about it, is a mathematical concept for an arbitrarily set domain of closeness around any point or element we like. So an attractor can have a neighborhood, so could a point that's not an attractor. Just because you're asking about attractors in particular, I should say that in the neighborhood of an attractor, we have a specific type of phenomenon called a basin of attraction. And you could say that the varying of the neighborhood effects around the attractor, we could develop this further to have to do with the changing of the shape and the behavior of the basin of attraction. What's interesting is if the attractor is like the gravitational node, you might say, this is not a great way to think it, but will suffice for now. The basin is this space around it where an orbit becomes pulled, right? So if I'm outside the basin and I'm close to the basin, I'm not pulled as a trajectory, as a vector toward the attractor. But once I enter this basin, I am pulled toward it. So this is something else to wonder about, is the modification of the shape and the magnitude of these basins. I think, yeah. By the way, clinically, I think we probably could develop intuitions about what these basins are like rather readily when you see, for instance, someone who perhaps tries to set aside some type of repetitive behavior for a time, and then there's a kind of event which announces again this pull, toward the familiar shape of thought, of behavior, of you name it, relationship. You could posit, okay, there was a basin that was operative there, and they stepped over into this basin, and then we had this effect of the attraction. Is that helpful, Manali, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was. Yeah. So just to ensure that I understood it right.
Yeah.
So for the time when, like this person is able to set aside the repetition, just for example, this person is outside of the basin and then gets pulled back in again following an event or
Yeah, we could posit that the orbit of subjective movement at that time is operating or moving outside of the basin of attraction, and then this changes presumably when we notice not only the recurrence itself of some kind of familiar motif, but maybe the kind of prelude to it, which I would posit to be the analog to the basin of attraction. Yeah. Axel, do you want to speak?
Merci, Jed. Euh,
Thank you,
Pardon, tout à
Jed.
l'heure, Benoît, dans sa conférence,
I'm sorry,
parlait
but
de point capiton.
today Benoit in a
En fait,
conference
quand tu as parlé de voisinage,
he was talking about topology, and
ça
he
m'a
was talking
rappelé
about
ce
a
que disait
point
ce
of
que disait Benoît,
capitone,
ce qui
point
revient
of
au même
capiton
endroit, mais qui n'est pas tout à
em
fait même,
francês.
qui
E
n'est
isso me
pas tout
lembrou
à
muito o que
fait
o
même,
Benoit
qui n'est
disse,
pas
aquilo
dans
que
le même
volta para o mesmo
voisinage.
lugar, mas que não é sempre o
Et
mesmo,
je voulais savoir si tu faisais un
porque não é
lien
o mesmo na mesma
avec les
vizinhança. Então,
attracteurs ou pas avec ce point de capiton.
I'm sorry, Jed. I think I was speaking in Portuguese, right? So I'm sorry. I'm
You
going to
were very
repeat.
exciting, though. Yeah, please.
So Benoit was mentioning the point of capitone, which is this idea that something might come back, but not to the same point. And then Axel was asking if this is related to the attractors.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how he's using that particular concept in with regard to dynamical systems theory, though I do think it probably relates. And in general, I've heard Benoit arrive at very similar conclusions about the importance of this recurrence that is not exactly to the point as such, but to the neighborhood. And that's actually right there within Poincaré, is that the recurrence is not necessarily to the degree of an exact return to the point from which we begin. Importantly, it's at the level of the neighborhood. By the way, as an aside, this is why when you look up something like strange attractors, which are an example of chaotic dynamics within a system, you see a kind of incredible thing, which is that the orbits at a local level behave in an entirely unpredictable way. But the overall shape and it produces these beautiful shapes that, are famously found readily on the internet, like the Lorentz attractor is this kind of butterfly-like shape, that is stable. So within my understanding anyway, is that within Poincare recurrence, we can have chaotic behavior of a very unpredictable quality at the local level, but we're still operating within the parameters of this idea that as long as the overall space is bounded, has finite volume, there will be recurrence at the level of neighborhood. So we can start to talk about a taxonomy in a way of not just stability and instability, but the combinations therein, variations of these types within this overall, under this umbrella of Poincare recurrence in general. Sorry to be a little bit technical and giving you more than you require, but that's what came to mind. I was being a little bit extra, as people say these days, right? How about Jonathan? Did you want to speak, Jonathan? Or maybe you changed your mind, which is okay. Please, Genjo.
Nice to see you, Jed. Thanks for the talk. I just wanted to offer Great Master Qingyuan, when he said the bit about the mountains, clarified that he doesn't mean that these mountains happen sequentially or developmentally, and that each moment is within this current moment. And then a monk asked him, "So what is the moment?" And he said, "Space." And the monk said, "Well, what is space?" And he said, "Time." So I think that works really well with what you're saying, but I was interested in how you would ping pong with that.
That was beautiful, man. That was beautiful. Thank you. Well, I think it nicely furthers these intuitions I've put forward, and it underlines something important, that my telling in the form of moments could obscure. And in fact, I made a note to myself, but I must have failed to do so. I was thinking of these moments in a dialectical sense, moments that are not necessarily chronological. So is it possible to think my three moments that I have culled from this Zen saying as operating in a temporality where they could be simultaneously occurring in different subspaces, for instance? Yes, of course. And I think it's important to keep that temporality away from the seductions of a simplistic just so story, yeah, as I've unfortunately framed it in a somewhat schematic form. But yeah, thank you so much. I love this. The moment is space, the moment is time.
Well, and with the clinical interpretation that you give it, that it's a really generative idea of what would it mean for us to think of each individual letter of the patient as being both the introductory sessions, the middle sessions, and the termination simultaneously.
Yeah, beautifully stated. And one thing I've worked on a bit with this respect is to try to push against, for instance, the notion that has become, I think, somewhat predominant in Lacanian circles anyway, that there's a global, total movement of the subject in its entirety from the preliminary to the analytic terrain to the end. I think when we have that in mind as an expected itinerary, we end up in a lot of trouble and it can unfortunately contribute to the analyst's resistance of the singularities of what are actually occurring, which might be, and I think the clinic readily shows this to us, we can have spaces that are quite alive with the question, with a dialectical movement of A does not equal A. And this can be absolutely entangled with and happening alongside spaces that do not possess this type of temporality of dialectical unfolding. We can have spaces that blow up and escape to infinity. This can all be co-occurring. So I think you bring an important point. So thank you very much. Jonathan, do you want to speak?
Yeah, that'd be great. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. It was very interesting almost hearing you speak between these two fields in a way, hearing what was coming up there. I was curious, this may be associative, I'm curious what will come up, but I was looking at the valences of syncopation, early usages in English, and there's a sort of grammatical form, like a contraction, where something gets almost slips into a new form, something like this. There was also a more medical usage, which I think was the earliest, which is almost a kind of a failing of the heart, failing of the action of the heart, and it can have quite severe, almost fatal consequences. And this interruption, almost this jolting of the very heart of being, I couldn't help but think of where the Black radical tradition comes from, where those kinds of readings of where these forms of playing, this need for a new form of being and speaking emerge from, some kind of break, some kind of historical break. If we think of the Middle Passage and how people see that deeper necessity in some way. And I wonder if there's a relevance there in relating this singularity of style that you're hearing through Monk's practice, relating that to somehow like events on a massive scale at a moment like this, where there's a shared basis in a kind of a field where each response is emerging in some way and can yield this creative practice or work in some way. And so it's a big thing, I guess, to ask, but how do you approach the singularity of style and in style to these kinds of massive pressures that are exerted on subjects in some way, whether it's colonial expansion and domination, say, yielding certain forms of literature, or whether it's Middle Passage systems of exploitation and slavery, not causing this form, but somehow leading to it in the displacement of peoples and the kind of interactions that happen. So sorry to the interpreters if that's complex associations, but
this is
they're
beautiful.
moving from what you're saying, so I'll place the blame at your feet.
Rather than adorn this thing that is already done, I don't want to gild the lily. I think we'll give you the last word, Jonathan. This was beautiful. I can only heart it, and pass the baton finally to Barbara to say adieu to you all.
Obrigada, Jed. Wow, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jed. Wow, Jonathan, thank you so much. I think answering this question, we would need maybe an extra half an hour. So probably this will remain, and it's almost the end of our time for today. Thank you so much, Jed, for your wonderful insights, this trip that you took us through music. Thank you for our dear translators, Gabriel, Gabo, who is working with Portuguese and English, and Anthony. We got two musicians and interpreters for this session today, and two Thelonious Monk's fans. I'd like to quickly pass on the floor to Killian, who has some announcements to make about our formation programs that are already open for subscription. Killian, can you join us?
Yes, just hello, everybody. Just a quick reminder for those who might have joined later. So this talk by Jed was, I think, a beautiful example for what the IIP stands for and also what the IIP is offering in their formations to use contemporary theory and apply it to clinic and find different viewpoints and also working on it together, what we saw in the discussion, how it all came together, new ideas came up. So there are two formations starting in September. One is Foundations for Contemporary Psychoanalysis. It is open for everybody. You don't need to have a clinical background for this. For the other one, it's more helpful because you will be using your experience as a clinician to work on it. It's called Techniques for a Contemporary Clinic. These two, like I said, will be starting in September, and you can apply for them now. Enrollment is open. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Much appreciated.
Obrigada, Killian. Aqui a
Thank you,
gente vai
Killian.
mandar. Killian poderia fazer o favor de
Killian,
encaminhar
could you send
aqui no chat
the links
os
in the
links
chat,
de
please,
inscrição
for
dessas
those
duas formações? Vocês conseguem
formation
acessar
programs?
nessa página,
This
os
way you
nossos
can access it.
programas.
You can
Vale a
also look
pena.
for us in the
Gostaria de agradecer a presença de todos,
Instagram, where you will
lembrar que a gente vai ter
find
próximo
more
IIP
information. We have a next IIP Talks with our dear Carla Vasquez, who's also a professor at the IIP. We're sending it in the chat right now. It will happen on July 4th. So check out our social networks. You can see our website. There you can find all information. If you need, you can write us an email. And I hope to see you in the IIP in our next encounters. Thank you so much, Jed. And thank you everyone who could join us today. Thank you for your support, Killian, and our interpreters. And may you all have a great Saturday.
Thank you. Obrigado. Merci.